Uh, Hi guys. Today I'm talking to Neil Coppen and Nibs van der Spuy, who've been very involved in the last couple of years with a project about the famous Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. Welcome guys. It's great to catch up.
Yeah, good to see you.
Hey,
and
nice to be here.
Good, Neil. I'm gonna start with you. And if you can just let us know when you first became interested in Fernando Pessoa.
Well, I mean, I attended DHS from 95 to 99. And over that period, there was a time when the plaque that's currently outside the DHS hall was being unveiled, and Mario Soros, president of Portugal, came, and there was this kind of huge fanfare about this famous old boy that went to the school that was this incredible Portuguese poet. But I didn't at the time know much about Pessoa, nor really kind of follow up. And you know, I during my whole time at DHS, I don't think I read a single piece by Pessoa. It was only kind of in my university days that I was in the course on Romance poetry or literature that I was studying. Pessoa came up, and once I read one of his pieces, I was just like, oh my goodness, this guy is beyond anything I know, really. And that started a kind of lifelong obsession. That seems to happen to people a lot of DHS old boys who kind of, you know, stumble upon his poetry and also realize when they went to the same school as this man that he changes your life forever. Certainly old boys like Roy Campbell and old headmasters, old teachers, and such as Jennings, who became a big historian on Pessoa. Their whole lives changed. They ended up going to Portugal, learning the language to translate Pessoa. And in a sense, the same things kind of happened to me. I've gone deeper and deeper into this journey of trying to understand him, and obviously sharing a school with someone you admire so much is a very thrilling kind of thing. It's like, I don't know, saying you went to the same school as kind of William Shakespeare in many senses.
Oh yeah, I mean that's great, and we're going to chat on, catch up a little bit more about what you've been involved in subsequently over the past couple of years. But Nibs, you know, coming to you and you being based in Lisbon at the moment, just let us know how I didn't know about Pessoa, and I think I mentioned it to you guys last time until Nibs and we started chatting. Neil, you know, I met you and got to know more about the poem. I didn't know about it, but Nibs, if you can just, you know, let us know, you know, how famous is Fernando Pessoa?
Well, I'll first start as well, where before I go into how famous it is how this all came together as well. I was playing with Howard Battery's son. Howard's on the foundation, board of foundation, and I was playing with his son at the Chris Seabrook Theatre. And Guy's wife is Brazilian, and we were doing sound check, and she saw the statue of Fernando Pessoa next to this Chris Seabrook Theatre at DHS. And she was saying, I can't believe it, that this guy who I studied in Brazil went to DHS. And it was at the time when I started, when I moved to Portugal, that's 6 years ago. And I thought I'd heard his name maybe, but I didn't know his poetry or anything. And anyhow, I moved to Portugal, and that same statue and that same figure who's at DHS, I saw him all over Lisbon. I mean, there's a place in a quarter they call a Chiado where there's a bronze statue with him where tourists from all over the world, and there's a vacant seat next to him, get their photo taken with him. Outside a coffee shop he used to frequent after he left DHS, went back to Portugal. So it started then. I thought, oh, that's a guy who's outside the Chris Seabrook Theatre. And then you walk a little bit further down and you've got this oldest bookshop in the world called Bertram's. And I took, a few years ago, I took Mr. Pinheiro, the headmaster of DHS there, just to show him how iconic this guy is. We walk into the oldest bookshop in the world, and at the window, front window, and as you enter the bookshelf, it's about 10 meters of shelf. It's just Fernando Pessoa. And Mr. Pinheiro saying, but is this the same guy who was at DHS? I said, yes. And he's everywhere. And then you walk a few shops further on, and you get these tourist shops, and then Fernando Pessoa's face is on coffee mugs, on T-shirts. He's a rock star in Portugal. Someone who died 35 years ago. There's a ravenous cult around him, and people are his legacy and his myth gets exponential because he died a pauper. He, as you know, he died in 19... and he only got discovered after his death, like a Van Gogh. And with each subsequent years, just in the 6 years I've been there, his myth and his presence is all over Lisbon and the whole of Portugal. As people say, I always tell people he's the second most famous iconic figure in Portugal. People say, who's the most famous? So it's an obvious answer. It's Cristiano Ronaldo, the footballer. And after him is Fernando Pessoa, without a doubt.
Now, Nibs, now just going on to your earlier story about, we're going to come to Neil now, going on to your earlier story about you playing at the Chris Seabrook Theatre, seeing the statue of Pessoa, Howard's son or daughter-in-law asking you about this guy. I'm assuming this prompted or started the process of what we're going to get onto now is a book about this famous poet. And Neil, I'm gonna you can come on to ask you now about, just tell us a little bit more. And as we know, I'm just going to share it to you, and I found these in is we know that Fernando Pessoa was an old boy of DHS, and here is his record in that attendance book of DHS. It goes back to about 1890, and there he is, his register, his date of birth, the date he entered DHS. So for people who didn't know that this famous poet, as Neil mentioned earlier, is a DHS Old Boy. Neil, and yeah, you can tell us more about, obviously the book and what is expected.
Well, the project really came about too so as I started discovering his poetry, I became just completely infatuated, started reading as much as I could. Nibs at the time had moved to Lisbon itself and could speak Portuguese and liked a huge passion for the man. And one day I was always reading Pessoa and through Guy Buttrey, Howard's son, I had a chat to Howard at the house one day when I went to visit Guy, and I heard that there was maybe some sort of family correlation between Pessoa and a Buttrey relative or someone who had known Pessoa's father while he was in Durban. And Howard obviously was hugely interested because of Pessoa's connection to DHS, and he really encouraged us to encourage Nibs and I to get together and really start, letting the world really know about his time at DHS and capitalizing on this idea that this is most certainly DHS's most famous, internationally famous old boy, and a writer who is just unlike any other. So, I mean, with my natural kind of interest, and I'm a playwright, I was at DHS like Pessoa. I received a wonderful education there. Certain educators took a great interest in my cultural path at the time, wanting to be a writer, a theatre maker, and really nourished that from the moment I got to DHS. And in many ways that happened to Pessoa. People identified his gifts quite early on, and he was given an education where he was really exposed to a large amount of writers and literature that would go on to influence him for the rest of his life. So, yeah, once I started researching, Nibs and I started digging through the archives a bit, and then we discovered the work of Hubert Jennings, who was a staff member at DHS. He wrote the book, The DHS Story, about the history of DHS. And while he was writing that book, he discovered Pessoa, and that amounted in a whole lifelong love affair for him, and really trying to understand and go visit the old boys. At the time he was writing this was in the 70s, 80s. There were still Pessoa classmates that were very elderly men at that point, but that he went and started interviewing and trying to find out what was Pessoa's time at DHS like? How was he remembered? Did people have a memory of him? Trying to fit these puzzle pieces together about his life in Durban. Because the strange part is Pessoa wrote a vast amount in his lifetime, but very seldom did he ever reflect back on his time in Durban and his childhood. So there's a lot of riddles and clues that he left us, but it's up to the kind of historian to try piece those together and get a sense of who this young man was and how the school shaped him, and what did it mean, you know, him getting an English education and then going back to Portugal and, you know, learning and loving all the famous English writers like Tennyson and Shakespeare and Milton and all those old writers, but then going back and writing in Portuguese again, but using a lot of the basis of English poetry that he had learned. So that created a very interesting fusion that really ignited his poetry in a way that kind of differentiates him from other very well-known Portuguese poets. So it's been a one, you know, then I've realized that there's a Richard Zenith is one of the biggest translators of Pessoa, and through Nibs, when I went to visit him in Lisbon, we got to meet Richard Zenith and find out about his research in Durban. He's also come to Durban to scrounge through the archives and newspapers and try to find any kind of remnants of Pessoa's legacy. And there's been surprisingly more than was initially thought. I think the initial historian said, you know, this is a big enigma, his time there, and we'll know very little. But through Jennings and Zenith and these wonderful scholars of Pessoa, a lot has actually emerged. And actually a lot of writing that he did while at DHS. It's not the best poetry yet. He's still a young poet finding his feet, but certainly you can see the beginnings of a genius forming, and an obsessive genius, because I think he spent more time in the DHS library than he did anywhere else in that school. I mean, he was reading voraciously throughout his entire time at DHS. So yeah, what we're trying to do now is create a new book, because a lot of these brilliant scholars and historians I've spoken about are quite academic about Pessoa. And I'm not a scholar in that way. I'm not a literary critic. I'm just a deeply passionate old boy who wants to make people fall in love with Pessoa and realize what a modern contemporary voice he was. I mean, he preceded the birth of existentialism way before other writers that are more well known for it, like Camus and that sort of thing. He really was revolutionary. So I would like to try and excite boys at the school about this old boy. That's really my task with this book, is to try to get young people excited about Pessoa and to realize why he's still so relevant and important to our lives today. You know, when we hear about poetry, we immediately turn off and think, oh gosh, I haven't read a poem since I was, 14 years old at high school. But Pessoa moves beyond poetry. He talks about the human condition in a way that only Shakespeare, I believe, did in a likewise fashion. He really understood the multifaceted aspects of our beings and the complexities of humanity. And he spent his life looking inwards, trying to untangle his own psychology. And as a result, we can learn a lot about, who we are as human beings. So I think he's a very important voice to bring again into the present. And certainly his new fame around the world is a testament to that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of the book obviously is based around his time at DHS and his time in Durban. And as you were saying last time we chatted, you've done a lot of research in and around the history of Durban at the time as well. So the book is based. Is it purely based around his time at DHS in Durban, or is it based around his life?
Yeah, it's not an authoritative autobiography on Pessoa at all. It is a look at that time in Durban, his 10 years that he spent here, his time at DHS particularly, but also the history of Durban. I mean, Pessoa was here at a very interesting time in KwaZulu-Natal's history, when you have kind of Churchill escaping from the Boer War and speaking on the steps of the City Hall and launching his political career essentially at the post office, which was the old City Hall back in the day. You have Mahatma Gandhi, who's at that time is just beginning to lay the foundations of his whole his principles and ethos and philosophy, and Durban shapes that. He's at the time that Pessoa was here, he's was locked in at the harbor, stuck on a boat with the white population of Durban, very fearful that this revolutionary was going to, get off and cause a whole lot of cuck in the colony, essentially. And then you have someone like Mark Twain, the famous writer of Tom Sawyer, who was here on a lecture series. And so I'm really interested in the moment in time that Pessoa was here, and this kind of cross-section of really seminal historic figures, and also how those figures might have impacted his young imagination. Pessoa very much encouraged us to travel through our imaginations. He didn't do a lot of traveling in his life outside of Durban. He went back to Lisbon and via a trip through the Azores, but beyond that, he stayed in Lisbon the rest of his life. So he never traveled. He believed that you could travel through your imagination, and that was enough. So the kind of premise of the book is to, through my own imagination, take us back to that time and imagine this young boy moving through this very interesting city. Obviously, the indentured laborers had come into Durban. There was a huge Indian population arriving, very vibrant Indian community, the Zulu community who had been there several hundred years before. There was this kind of really weird and interesting multicultural fusion going on. And I think it's surprising that it didn't inspire his literary imagination more, in the sense that he wrote about it, which he didn't. So I'm trying to, for readers and for Portuguese visitors and visitors from around the world who want to come to Durban and understand the poet here, it's not a travel book essentially, but it will allow you to really move through the city and imagine a time that has long passed and what that meant, and also politically what was happening at that time. I think those are important contexts to understand the sort of education Pessoa was receiving at the time.
Yeah, I know, and it's an amazing time in our history. I mean, we chatted about it last time. I've looked back through old DHS school magazines, of which the first edition came out in 1901. DHS Old Boys, or DHS Old Boys Association, was formed in 1901. They had their first meeting in 1901. In fact, I got asked the question the other day, trustee, how old is the DHS Old Boys Club? And I went back in history. I thought it was the one that was built in Durban North, but it wasn't. The DHS Old Boys Club Association goes back to 1901. So it's a wonderful time, as you say, in the school, and not only the school's history, but in Durban's history. So I think we're looking forward to a very interesting read, which we will, we discussed earlier, which we, over a period of time, which brings me on to Nibs' next question. We'll be chatting a lot more, is based around the book. Nibs, you've now decided to join in and do a fundraising initiative or fundraising drive for the education of the school. And that's a cycle from London to Lisbon, as I said, we'll touch a lot more about it over the next couple of months. But just tell us a little bit more about your ideas and your intentions.
Okay, when I was helping Neil with some research, I was going through the Hubert Jennings book. He talks about in 1904 where Fernando Pessoa was a top pupil in the whole of Natal, actually. And he was meant to win the exhibition prize, which would have afforded him the privilege of going to study at Cambridge, or Oxford. And he didn't win it because his trip in South Africa was broken by, they took a sabbatical year back to Portugal. So you had to be like 4 consecutive years to win the prize. So he didn't win that prize. It went to Clifford Geertz. And anyway, I was just thinking, as Neil was saying now, Pessoa never left Lisbon, but he could have gone to study in the UK, and that got my imagination going. I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we did start? Imagine it, he would have maybe been a poet in England, and he didn't get there. So I thought, why not start at the London Eye? And also thought there's a lot of old boys in the UK, and I just thought it'll be great to have a fundraiser. I do a lot of cycling in my spare time, but I mean, to get the foundation involved with the old boys around the world and in Europe, and to do a fundraiser cycle over 30 days. Well, close on 30 days from the London Eye all the way through Brittany, through the southwest of France, through rural Spain, through Salamanca, then cutting through into Portugal, doing Old Roman Road into the Alentejo, and eventually ending up at Portugal's most famous landmark, who Pessoa wrote about in his guidebook, which is the Torre de Belém, the Belém Tower. And I just thought it'll give the opportunity. I know when we started the mission of the book, Howard Battery always said, any proceeds of the book must go towards education. Educating maybe a underprivileged person to come and study at Pessoa's old school. And you speak to Portuguese people here about it, and the publishers who are interested in the book, they said it's the most fantastic idea, you know, and to get us aligned to maybe to a Portuguese school here in Lisbon. But I just thought, just to get the hype going at the time when the book is released, to create awareness, like over 30 days, you know, get the book into people's hearts and minds through social media and the cycle, and to raise money. So I just thought it was a good idea, you know.
No, it's a great idea, and I'm sure, you know, on behalf of the school, I think I can speak on behalf of the school and the foundation. It's really generous of you, and I think it will create a lot of hype, and you know, as I said earlier, as we go down the months, we'll start sort of disclosing a lot more information about your cycle tour and how Old Boys can get involved. Because I'm sure what you'll want to do is you'll want Old Boys to join you out on the road. But you know, we can disclose that information down the time. With regards to the book, we can we can also let Old Boys know a lot more as it transpires and we get much closer to publication of the book. But I think, you know, from my side, I'd just like to thank the two of you for joining me today. Really appreciate it. We will through the months inform the Old Boys and the Fernando Pessoa fanatics. I think we're not only going out to Fernando to DHS Old Boys, we're going out to Fernando Pessoa fanatics about the book, about the cycle, and we will keep the Old Boys informed more about that as we go. But just from my side, I just want to say thanks so much for the effort that you've put into this project so far, and thanks for joining me today and enlightening us more about what is to come with regards to your project on Fernando Pessoa.
Well, for us, you know, it's just such an incredible opportunity, you know, and we just know Neil's going to write the most fantastic book, and there's a gap in the market for it. Believe me, I met with the publishers on Friday, and they super excited about it. They're super excited about what we're doing, and they're 100% behind us on this venture. So thanks for giving us the opportunity.
Oh, great.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks.